Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, safely back in the studio. I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are you doing?
I'm warm, Michael. I'm very, very warm.
Coming up later in the show, the Met Police have confiscated coconuts from people at a protest. We'll find out why. The election betting scandal keeps getting worse. Labour are now implicated, though not nearly to the extent that the Conservatives are. And we speak to Faiza Shaheen live about her independent campaign in Chingford and Woodford Green. Julian Assange is finally free. This is the moment he arrived in Canberra, the capital of his home country, Australia, after 5 years of imprisonment in London's Belmarsh prison and 14 years of legal persecution by the US government. The 52-year-old WikiLeaks founder was greeted with cries of welcome home. The end of Assange's legal battle with US authorities took place in a court on the small Northern Mariana Islands. That's a US territorial outpost in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. On Wednesday morning, local time, Assange pled guilty to a single felony, conspiring to unlawfully obtain and disseminate classified information. Under the terms of a plea deal reached between Assange's lawyers and the US government last week, the judge sentenced Assange to time already served. After that, he flew to Canberra, where Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese welcomed Assange home via telephone call. Later, Albanese told journalists what he and Assange had talked about.
Mr. Assange and I, this evening, as I said, I've never met Mr. Assange. I had a very warm discussion with him this evening, though. He was very generous in his praise of the Australian government's efforts. The Australian government stands up for Australian citizens. That's what we do. Thanks very much.
The end to Assange's legal battles with the US was heavily influenced by Albanese's intervention in the case after he repeatedly advocated for the journalist's release, both publicly and diplomatically. Now, in fact, he is the only Australian Prime Minister to have spoken out in support of Assange and against Australia's ally, the United States, since the extradition case began. According to Assange's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, Assange told Albanese that he had, quote, saved his life. But amid the celebrations, Robinson also had this to say about the meaning of the case.
Julian has suffered for more than 14 years because of the risk of extradition to the United States. He faced 175 years in prison for publishing evidence of war crimes, human rights abuse, and US wrongdoing around the world. Today, he pleaded guilty to an offence for having published information in the public interest, for which he's won journalism awards the world over and been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize every year for the past decade. This sets a dangerous precedent. This prosecution sets a dangerous precedent that should be of concern to journalists everywhere. The US is seeking to exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction over all of you without giving you constitutional free speech protections. And anyone who cares about free speech and democratic accountability should stand against it.
Assange's freedom also means he is finally reunited with his family. As Assange left the plane in Canberra, he was greeted by his wife, international lawyer Stella Assange. It was an emotional reunion for the couple who married in Belmarsh prison in 2022 and who have 2 children together. Speaking to reporters after Assange's release, Stella Assange conveyed this message from the WikiLeaks founder.
Julian wanted me to sincerely thank everyone. He wanted to be here. But you have to understand what he's been through. He needs time. He needs to recuperate. And this is a process. I ask you, please, to give us space, to give us privacy, to find our place, to let our family be a family before he can speak again at a time of his choosing.
There was some speculation about whether Assange would be allowed to speak about the case or whether the plea deal had contained a gag order. But Assange's US lawyer, Barry Pollock, confirmed to the press that it had been an essential requirement of Assange's legal team that the journalist not spend any more time in prison nor be silenced by any legal order. Assange's plea deal came just weeks after his legal team made some progress on his case. Just last month, Julian Assange had been granted the right to appeal the extradition order signed by the UK government, which would have seen him imprisoned in the United States. Stella Assange went on to say this about the timing of the plea deal.
I think it's important to recognise that Julian's release and the breakthrough in the negotiations came at a time when there had been a breakthrough in the legal case in the UK, in the extradition, where the High Court had allowed permission to appeal. There was a court date set for the 9th and 10th of July, an upcoming court date in which Julian would be able to raise the First Amendment argument at the High Court. And it is in this context that things finally started to move. I think it revealed how uncomfortable the United States government is, in fact, of having these arguments aired. Because the fact is that this case is an attack on journalism, it's an attack on the public's right to know, and it should never have been brought. Julian should never have spent a single day in prison. But today we celebrate, because today Julian is free.
Because of his felony conviction, Julian Assange is now banned from entering the United States without special permission, but his family have vowed to press on and fight for a full presidential pardon. Ash, I want your thoughts on this. Had a very interesting sort of conversation with Yanis Varoufakis yesterday, where he was sort of suggesting this is the third time that Assange had been offered a plea deal. This was the first time he accepted. I hadn't realised, I wasn't sure if this was public knowledge before sort of Yanis said it, but really shocking. So he was saying that actually Donald Trump had offered him a pardon, but only if he revealed some of his sources, basically to get Donald Trump out of a pickle. And then more recently, he was offered a plea deal, which would have sort of a similar process, but he would have had to have gone to the continental United States, which he didn't trust. Have you been sort of surprised by this move?
I think that the timing took me by surprise, seeing as that it seemed that the US had been ramping up its attempt to extradite him. This was definitely a pleasant surprise. I can completely understand why Julian Assange and his legal team completely and utterly rejected the plea deals supposedly offered to him before, particularly if they involved disclosing of journalistic sources. I think this is one of the things which is really critical about the Julian Assange case, which is that because he was a journalist whose work involved exposing the crimes of the American state, because he bypassed the usual means of publication, people in the industry didn't see him as one of their own. They didn't see him as a journalist who was being criminalized for legitimate journalistic work and being pressured to reveal his sources that even the most, dreadful hack in Fleet Street would say you should absolutely never do. So I think that there was a problem of journalistic solidarity there. I think that I've been trying to think about my own responses to the Julian Assange case, in particular with regards to the allegations of sexual misconduct, I suppose you would say, sex acts which, breach the scope of someone's consent. And at the time, my feeling was very much, okay, well, what you've got to try and do is separate what the American state is trying to do, which is extradite him and try him on charges of espionage, and what the Swedish state is trying to do, which is investigate claims of sexual misconduct. And obviously, as a feminist, I was very much feeling like, yeah, this has to be investigated, because I was coming at it from the position of a woman who knows how difficult it is to even come forward with that kind of thing, let alone to be believed by the authorities. I think now I look at it with perhaps a lot less of the certainty that I used to. That's not to say that, women are liars, or like, it was all just a smear automatically. They may have been true allegations. There may have been some truth to the allegations. There may have been no truth to the allegations. But I think, to me, what's clearer now is that there was certainly something of a relationship between this investigation the attempt to extradite him to Sweden, and also the judicial process that the US wanted to get started. And I think that, a few years ago, I looked at it primarily through a lens of feminism, where also, don't forget, being in a context where it was very, very difficult to talk openly about issues of sexual violence, particularly sexual violence on the left. And I think that I tried to go, oh, you can make these things completely separate. Whereas now, I look back on it and I think maybe they weren't that separate.
I mean, Yanis was sort of saying yesterday, if you looked in detail at the case, it did sort of fall apart under scrutiny. I'm not an expert enough to know. There definitely were some people, I think, who, the pursuit of an extradition, sort of when it was formally a case by the United States for espionage, ended up with a bit of egg on their face. When there's James Ball, he was a journalist who actually worked with Assange, who sort of said when he was still in the Ecuadorian embassy, the only person keeping Assange sort of in prison or imprisoned is himself. He should just go face justice in Sweden. The Americans aren't really interested, and then the Americans obviously slap an espionage charge on him, which I think is what Assange had been fearing the whole time. With just over a week to go until the election, the Gamblegate scandal has for days been producing damaging headlines for the Tories. But the betting bug appears to be infectious and has now hit Labour's campaign too. The party has suspended a candidate after he came under investigation by the Gambling Commission. Kevin Craig was Labour's candidate for Central Suffolk and North Ipswich, but lost the party's support after it emerged he'd placed a bet on, and wait for this, him losing the election. This is obviously a different situation to the Tory figures. So they were allegedly placing bets using insider information. So they knew there was going to be a snap general election and sort of scurried to the betting booths before the general public could get wind of what was going on. This is somewhat different. This man didn't know when the election would be. He didn't have insider information, but much like a sort of sports person betting on the outcome of their own match, he is betting on something over which he has some control. Now, I don't think there's any suggestion, though, that he would have intentionally thrown the election so as to win. I don't know how much money he'd gambled. My understanding is it's fairly small amounts these people are gambling. In a statement, Craig said this: "A few weeks ago when I thought I would never win this seat, I put a bet on the Tories to win here with the intention of giving any winnings to local charities. While I did not place this bet with any prior knowledge of the outcome, this was a huge mistake for which I apologise unreservedly. I deeply regret what I have done and will take the consequences of this stupid error of judgment on the chin." Craig also happens to be a pretty big Labour donor, having given over £100,000 to the party over the last few years. Something I'm sure had absolutely nothing to do with his selection as a candidate. Obviously, the selections ended up being fairly undemocratic. If you donated a lot of money to the party, that somewhat helps you getting a seat, one would imagine. Now that he's been suspended, Labour says that it will be returning that money. Some people might think of that as a refund, right? Craig also gave £13,000 to Shadow Health Minister Wes Streeting, who has also pledged to give the cash back. Now, unlike Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer acted quickly to suspend his candidate once news of the gambling regulator's investigation broke. That seems like a sensible strategy as the fallout of the Tories' betting scandal continues to grow. A fifth Tory has now come under investigation for allegedly betting on the date of the election before Rishi Sunak announced it. Russell George is a Tory member of the devolved Welsh Parliament, the Senedd. As a result of the investigation, he's stepped back from the Welsh Shadow Cabinet. Interestingly, George is the MS for Montgomeryshire. That's also the Westminster seat of Tory MP Craig Williams, who has been implicated in the gambling scandal too. The former private parliamentary secretary to Rishi Sunak was finally suspended from the party on Tuesday, weeks after he admitted placing a bet on the date of the election 3 days before it was called. Also suspended from the party on Tuesday was Laura Saunders, standing in Bristol North West. Both Saunders and Williams will remain on the ballot paper as Tory candidates, but will enter Parliament as independents if elected. Now, not many people with Conservative next to their name on the ballot paper are going to get elected, but some people will, could be them. Saunders' husband, Tony Lee, is also being investigated by the Commission. He's the Tories' campaigns director and has now taken a leave of absence, along with Nick Mason, the party's chief data officer. A Met police officer from Rishi Sunak's close protection unit was arrested last week on suspicion of misconduct in public office in connection to the scandal. So not just affecting politicians. The Metropolitan Police have now confirmed that a further 5 officers are being investigated over election betting after the Gambling Commission handed the force their names. Ash, I think here there's a clear-cut issue, which is the people who sort of bet on the election date using insider information. Obviously, a terrible look for the Conservatives. This has also had massive cut-through, so all the people who are sort of polling people on what issues they're paying attention to. The D-Day incident was number 1, and this Gamblegate is now number 2, both issues that make the Conservatives look completely terrible. So they're already, struggling in this campaign. It's just gone from bad to worse. The Labour issue seems somewhat different. So, I'm not in with these people, so I don't know this firsthand. But sort of on Twitter, I've seen a bunch of sort of political journalists suggesting there are a fair few MPs who sort of bet against themselves as a sort of joke consolation. So if they lose, at least they win 100 quid or whatever. And it's sort of a light-hearted thing to do. Now, it does seem to me that the regulation should be changed so you can't do that, much like a footballer can't bet on a football match. But it also doesn't seem like a sort of a huge violation of the public's trust. What do you think?
Look, when it comes to violations of the public's trust, I'd probably point towards the idea that you can donate like 100 grand and then, suddenly you are picked as a Labour candidate. It's not a million miles away from donating, 300 grand plus to get selected as a Tory peer. It's not a million miles away from the idea that cash is corroding politics. So when it comes to violations of the public trust, I would say that is, for me, absolutely number 1. Underneath that, of course, is if you're using insider information to profit, right? That's deeply unfair. It shouldn't happen. And it's a clear violation of gambling rules and regulations. And then lower down the food chain, as you said, are these MPs who place a bet as a sort of consolation prize for if they lose, and then, maybe they'll give it to charity or something like that. Wink, wink. I don't think that that's so much of a violation of public trust, but I do think that it should be the same as in sport. You can't bet on a match or an event that you're competing in. I think what this points to, this latter point about politicians betting on themselves, it speaks to, I think, something which has changed very much within the betting industry. The betting industry is always trying to find new people to bring in. All right, the majority of the money which is made by the betting industry, it comes from, pretty hardcore regular gamblers, many of whom I think could safely be described as addicts. And so what you're trying to do is constantly expand that pool of people who are being brought into betting. So amongst betting companies, they expanded what's called novelty betting. By novelty betting, it's events that normally aren't the subjects of gambling. So not horse racing, not boxing, not football, but something like an election, its outcome, how many seats, when and where. And this is sort of a bit of a black hole in regulatory terms for betting and gambling. And that's why you've not seen a sort of equalization of the rules between sports betting and novelty betting, because it's something which is relatively new. So I think that's one for the Gambling Commission to sort out, in my opinion.
Interesting, actually, yeah, because I had sort of read that sort of political betting was a bit of a loss leader. They sort of did it basically just to appear in newspaper articles. But that's a good point, sort of how to bring more and more people into the gambling industry. As you say, the people that the betting industry make money off are people who, I suppose what would they'd probably call them serial bettors. I think most other people would probably call them gambling addicts. Obviously, I imagine the betting industry is less willing to use that phrase because that's how they make their money. But they want people, who are betting on the football every weekend or 3 times a week, whatever. Obviously, it'd be very difficult to become a gambling addict when it comes to general elections because they only happen every 5 years. But maybe the idea is that this will bring more people in who then get their William Hill account. And after they've got their William Hill account, then they say, well, maybe I'll bet on the football as well this weekend. And then you can get addicted because it's something that you can bet on much more regularly. The polls from Islington North showing Jeremy Corbyn trailing his old party show the challenges of standing as an independent against a major party. And Corbyn is not the only person who's taken that challenge on. I'm joined now by Faiza Shaheen, who is standing against Labour in Chingford and Woodford Green after they blocked her candidacy at the last minute in a very unjust way, as we've discussed many times on this show. Faiza, thank you for joining us. First of all, can we get a sort of update on how your campaign is going?
Yeah, it's been quite an emotional roller coaster these last few weeks, and it's been amazing, honestly, this campaign. It's just, we had to turn it around so quickly, and we have such incredible support from the community. It's, as you know, I ran in 2019 as well, and just so many people keep coming up to me every time I walk out the house, just saying it's appalling what happened to me, that they still support me, that they're really upset with what the Labour Party's done in parachuting in another candidate here from Brent. And it's just been really joyful and energetic. I mean, it's a lot. It's only been 3 weeks since we launched the campaign. My posters are everywhere. There's a lot of momentum behind the campaign here, and a couple of tactical voting sites now have withdrawn their advice to vote Labour here, which is just amazing. It just goes to show, testament to all the work that volunteers are doing on the ground here.
And sort of, what have you thought about that Corbyn poll? Because I assume there hasn't been a sort of constituency poll in your constituency, Chingford and Woodford Green, but Jeremy Corbyn, probably the highest profile independent standing in the country at this election, in a seat he's been MP in for 41 years. I mean, even he is, struggling against the Labour Party, according to that poll, of course. I mean, it's not like the most rock solid scientific proof ever, but it's as good as it gets, really. How have you responded to that? Has that sort of worried you at all?
Yeah, I saw it. I mean, I was worried in the sense that we want Jeremy Corbyn to win, but I would say it's a completely different battle here, because there it's a 2-horse race, right? Jeremy Corbyn and Labour, but here it's myself, Labour, and Conservative and Reform eating into the Conservative vote. So it's a different dynamic here. It's not a 2-horse race, and I've been in that race, and I was in 2019. So you need a lot more votes and a higher share. Whereas here, it's split 3 ways, so we can even 4 ways. So it is a different dynamic. So it was interesting to see that. It's definitely hard to win as an independent because people are so used to just ticking like the Labour box. But I think because I've been working here for so long, and I grew up here and I live here, and people know about me and everything that happened to me. So I was in like the national news for a week. People do know much more about me than they ordinarily would have. Think so. Yeah, I haven't been an MP here for 40 years, but people do know me getting involved with stuff over the years.
And could you talk about, I suppose, the process of canvassing people as an independent? I suppose I'm especially interested in people who tell you they're undecided, right? So people who might say, look, Faiza, I like you, but I also really want to get rid of the Conservatives, so I'm thinking of voting Labour. I mean, how does that conversation go?
Yeah, no, it's really the main thing that comes up, really, is like, I want to vote for Faiza, but I'm scared of splitting the vote. And listen, I've spent a massive chunk of my life, all kinds of weather, being out fighting Ian Duncan Smith. So, I get it. I want to get him out too. That's still the primary aim. But what we're finding is, once you tell people, of course, the Tories are out of government, and we have an opportunity in Chingford and Woodford Green to vote for who we want, that people are moving more towards me. I mean, in terms of firm promises, when we look at our canvassing data, and genuinely we've been surprised by the positivity, we're getting more firm yeses than the Tories and Labour. But yeah, of course, there are undecideds. And they, we are putting out our canvassing data. That's the best we can do from conversations around the constituency. And yeah, I mean, it's a shame we don't have that kind of local poll done by an independent company that could just help people with this. But, we're pointing to the tactical voting sites. We're pointing to our, it's kind of over 8,000 conversations now on the doorstep to show that actually there is momentum. And also people are seeing the posters everywhere. You barely see it. I mean, I think I've seen one Tory poster weirdly put next to mine, because apparently the guy in that house decided that he only wants me or him, Ian Duncan Smith, because at least we understand local issues. It's a weird one. But I've seen 2 Labour posters, and like there's so many of me, and so that's giving people this sense of like, okay, the momentum's with the Faiza Shaheen campaign.
You say you've spoken to 8,000 people, not you personally, obviously, but your campaign, and that must be in the last 3 weeks. I mean, how does it work? Because obviously the Labour Party has built up data for years, presumably decades even. I don't know. How do you know what doors to knock on? How does it work if you just started a campaign 3 weeks ago?
Yeah, so basically we've been collecting the data for years. Like when I came in as a candidate in 2018, parts of the constituency had only about 8% contact rate. And now it's like really, really high because we've been working so hard. A lot of those volunteers have come with me. They've quit the Labour Party and come with me. So we have a good understanding of where the progressive vote is because we live here. We've been knocking on doors for a long time. We are having to start from scratch with the data, and it's a different conversation now because obviously we're telling people to vote independent and we're recording that data. We've got a different app. Actually, we just had incredible help. I think the reason why this campaign is doing so well is that so many people, even that in the constituency and outside the constituency, just really want me to win after everything that happened with Labour, but also because they want some critical voices. I mean, the reason that Labour kicked me out is because they don't want anyone that's going to in any way criticize them from the left, and a lot of people disagree with that on principle and are using their skills to help us. So we've had amazing data people help us get a new app and get things running. What was interesting about doing the canvassing though is that how many Conservative voters are saying to us, okay, I wasn't going to vote Conservative this time, I could never vote Labour, but now that you're independent and we like that you're local, we can vote for you. It's coming up a lot. And also despondency, loads of people that were like, I don't want to vote for the major parties. And so this gives them another choice. So yeah, that's been amazing. But we do need loads more help. We've got a week left. So if people want to come down to Chingford Woodford Green and help us by knocking on doors, delivering leaflets, we don't have the party machinery behind us anymore, and that gives us all this freedom to do things the way we want to do it. But it does mean we need more volunteers. And Ronnie O'Sullivan has joined the campaign, which has been amazing. He came for a rally and now he just keeps coming because he just loves door knocking with us.
That's so good. And he might be Chingford's most sort of famous, most loved resident, Ronnie O'Sullivan, the snooker player, I would imagine. So that's a pretty big get. Finally, before I let you go, could you just talk about some of the issues you're talking about on the doorstep? Because I suppose, a key issue, obviously, that I think our audience will be well aware of is sort of the injustice done to you. But are there also sort of wedge issues? I suppose I'm thinking of Gaza especially.
Yes.
Is that something that's coming up on the doorstep?
Yeah, I think people know that, the major reason why I was kicked out was because of my position on Palestine. And a massive part of the community here is really upset about that. Not just the Muslims, who are a significant chunk of the vote, but beyond that, and just, anger at the position that Labour took. So definitely Gaza comes up. Of course, people want to know that I'm going to be still pushing on the things that are important to us here locally. Rebuilding Whips Cross Hospital. And there's a bridge closure here. They want someone that they know is going to fight their corner. And there's a lot of concern here about the way the Labour councils have behaved, whether it's building housing, overdevelopment, unaffordable housing. And they know that I'm someone that's not just going to go along with things. And that's their worry about the Labour candidate, for instance. They know that part of the reason I've got in trouble is because I put this community first, and I'm outspoken. So Gaza's certainly been coming up. It was coming up loads when I was running as Labour, which they hated me saying. But now it's a reason that people want to vote for me. Yeah.
And if people want to campaign for you in this last weekend before the general election, what should they do?
Yes, please come and campaign for me and our incredible community campaign. So just go to my website, www.faizashaheen.co.uk, and there's an events page and it's all listed there, and you're very welcome, and you can buddy up with someone if you've never done that before. I can hear the baby start crying now. He's done.
Well, the last time we heard about your baby crying was in that terrible NEC panel. So I hope this was a more enjoyable conversation for you than that one. Thank you so much for joining us, Faiza. Good luck with everything. So this was the moment today in London when the Metropolitan Police began arresting coconuts. Of course, that's not quite true. They're presumably collecting them as evidence, but it's still a pretty strange sight, or seizing the coconuts. So what's going on? Well, the police were shutting down a protest outside a court appearance by Marieha Hussain, who is charged with committing a racially aggravated public order offence. And this was the offence in question. Holding up a sign at a Palestine protest depicting Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman as coconuts. The implication of calling them coconuts being that they are, in some sense, brown on the outside and white on the inside. After she was interviewed by the police under caution, Marieha Hussain released this video via the group Cage.
I had a placard with me depicting Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman as coconuts. A far-right pro-Zionist Twitter page uploaded my picture, and within 6 minutes it was commented on by the Metropolitan Police saying that they were looking for me. Since then, I have lost my job. I have been subjected to an abusive police interview. I've been harassed by the police in the middle of the night. I've had to leave home. I've had to leave my children behind. I've had to pull my son out of school for a short period of time. I'm currently 4, almost 5 months pregnant, and I'm still in limbo on whether I will be charged or whether this case will be dropped. 6 months down the line, we have over 40,000 people killed in Gaza, and the focus is on my placard and criminalizing people like me.
So we started the section with the kind of humorous video, I thought, of the police seizing coconuts. Obviously a serious issue here. The woman who's lost her job now, facing the law. Seems like a very stressful situation. Ash, what's your take on what's going on here?
I mean, look, obviously the police seizing coconuts at a demo is inherently comedic, but the actual issue at the heart of it, I think, is really, really serious, because what we're seeing is that the state has taken it upon itself to police how people of colour talk about race within their own communities. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that, calling somebody a coconut or an Uncle Tom or whatever is morally neutral. It is quite plainly discourteous, abrasive, rude, offensive. It's intended to be derogatory, but that doesn't mean that it's racist. It's not connected to upholding white supremacy the way in which other examples of racist language are. And already as a culture, we have come to a point where we can establish that there's a difference when different groups of people use a word. I mean, to take, for example, something like the N-word, it's very rare that today in big 2024, you're going to hear white people saying, oh, well, he can say it, why can't I say it? We've arrived at a point where we know that it is different for Black people to use the N-word versus non-Black people. And I think that language around, coconuts or Uncle Toms, for me, it falls in the same category. It's just different depending on who uses it. I think that it's really concerning that the police are being used in this way, that free speech is being, I think, cracked down upon by the state, whereas actually this should be a matter, for debate amongst communities of colour to come to a sort of consensus about its use or not.
I mean, I do tend to agree with you. I suppose it's worth, because I know you said sort of racism there is upholding white supremacy. So it's not racist because it's not upholding white supremacy. I suppose a different definition of racism, which I assume is, what's being deployed here, is racism is saying something to someone because of their race, or making a judgment about them because of their race. And then the coconut is a symbol of being a race traitor. So you're brown, but you're not acting brown, you're acting white. And so it seems like there is a charged critique of Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman because of their race, and therefore it's racist. I mean, I suppose, what do you think of that distinction? And I suppose you wouldn't really expect, if you want to have laws about racism, you wouldn't really expect it to be sort of encoded in the statute book that racism equals the enforcement of white supremacy. You would expect a more sort of neutral one, where racism is judging someone or making a statement about them, making a negative statement about them because of their skin color. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I completely see that. And I'm not saying that what should be in the statute books is the definition of racism that I've used. But the CPS has a great deal of latitude when it comes to deciding whether a prosecution is or isn't in the public interest. This is an example where it is clearly not in the public interest, I think, to drag this woman through the legal system, to upend her life. Her sign generated backlash. Now, that backlash, I think, is extremely distressing to experience, particularly when you're being held up as a hate figure. It is also an example of free speech. And so I wouldn't want the state to come, crashing in there. And that's where it should have stayed. It absolutely should not have been a matter for the courts. There is one thing that I suppose I want to differ with you a bit on. Like I said, I think that the word coconut or the word Uncle Tom is extremely, extremely abrasive, rude, and offensive. But there are versions of that trope which are very much a sort of staple of comedy and pop culture, particularly from people of color. I mean, you look at Carlton from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, didn't use those words, but that was the essence of the joke. You look at the sketches in Goodness Gracious Me. There was a particular sketch where you had two couples who are supposed to be, more English than the English and obsessed with getting English customs right. Again, didn't use the word, but that's the core of the comedy. And I think one of the reasons why sometimes white people really don't like the word coconut, they seem to find it more offensive than all the other racist words or racialized words, is because it presents whiteness as not being aspirational.
That's interesting. One last provocation to put to you. So the position on the right that I've seen, on the pro-free speech right, is to say, yes, of course it's wrong that this woman is getting prosecuted, but who are the left to now cry foul when they have been sort of the principal prime movers when it comes to legislation which makes it illegal to say something racially insensitive? How do you respond to that?
Well, I suppose what I'd say is that when it comes to how legislation is used, maybe this is where I differ from some people on the left, is that for me, it's not just being racially insensitive that for me is a matter for the law. I think you've got to combine it with something like targeted harassment, threats to safety, or an expectation, a reasonable expectation that there's a threat to your safety, or a kind of institutional discrimination as well. I don't think that the Speech Act of racial insensitivity alone should ever be a matter for the state. That's my personal take on it. I know that others may disagree with me.
Do you think we need a First Amendment a la the United States? They've got their constitutional free speech amendment. I've seen some sort of American commentators saying, my God, they need a free speech amendment in the United Kingdom when they see sort of lots of these issues where someone holding up an insensitive sign ends up being questioned by the police. Do you think, should we go down that route?
Should we have a First Amendment? I'm not inherently against it. I mean, the thing about British law is that it's so attritional. It's one thing layered on top of another. If you try to bring in one really big law that changes everything, I wonder how much else would change as well. For instance, protection from harassment and discrimination in the workplace, for instance. Would that mean that it's trumped by the First Amendment? I suppose one of the things that we do have is that, we are signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights. The Tories hate it an awful lot. And there are articles regarding free expression. Now, that's different from free speech, but we do have the right to free expression, and the implementation of legislation and the interpretation of legislation should always be read in relation to that protected right. So maybe we don't need a First Amendment. Maybe what we need is a proper implementation of the rights that we do have. I'm not sure. Maybe you should have trained as a lawyer, Michael. My mum was right.
Keir Starmer recently took part in a hustings hosted by the Sun newspaper, where he was asked about irregular migration.
On the question of returns, because you raised that, which is very important, the number of people being returned to where they came from has dropped off by 44% under this government. So on the first few days in government, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put the staff back in the returns unit. I'll make sure that we've got planes going off, not to Rwanda, because that's that's an expensive gimmick. They will go back to the countries where people come from. That's what used to happen.
Where I mean, it's so hard to do.
Well, at the moment, people coming from countries like Bangladesh are not being removed because they're not being processed.
ITV journalist Shahab Khan shared that video with this caption. Lots of anger among the British Bangladeshi community about these comments from Keir Starmer. And then he sort of quoted the key comments. I'll make sure we get planes going off back to the countries where people came from. At the moment, people coming from Bangladesh are not being removed. Andrew Feinstein, who's standing against Starmer in his constituency, has also reacted. He said this: Starmer saying he'll return Bangladeshis to Bangladesh. How can this man claim to be Labour? How can he represent a diverse, inclusive, progressive constituency like Holborn and St Pancras? Ash, I'm not really sure what I think about this one. I really like Andrew Feinstein. I think he's a brilliant candidate. I do think he has more integrity than Keir Starmer. At the same time, I'm not really sure, Starmer was saying send Bangladeshis back to Bangladesh. He was saying people who don't have a right to be here, so people who have claimed asylum and have been rejected, they should be deported to their country of origin where we have an agreement with that country. He's asked for an example. He says, well, an example is Bangladesh. We do have an agreement with Bangladesh. It is safe to return people there if they've had their asylum claim rejected, by the way. Obviously, some people will be escaping discrimination there. And so I felt like he kind of just brought it up as an example. But I don't know. I want your perspective on this.
Well, look, I think there's a few things to mention. The first thing is that we don't actually receive all that many asylum applications from Bangladesh compared to other countries. I believe it's not even in the top 5. Similarly, Bangladeshis aren't particularly represented amongst small boats arrivals. So maybe he's just picking a country out of the air, or maybe, and even unconsciously, it's sort of building on an ambient climate of hostility and disdain for Bangladeshis in particular. And this is the thing that I think is going on. Because if you look back through the history of asylum discourses in this country, you've often had this thing where particular ethnicities, particular nationalities are picked on as an emblem of, bad people from a bad country. The way Donald Trump would have phrased it horribly was something like shithole countries. Now, in the early 2000s, you heard a lot of that about Bangladeshis, Albanians, Somalis. And I think that we're seeing a similar return to those discourses through the sort of lens of this small boats crisis. And I think that that's what's kind of speaking here, is this history of Bangladeshis being seen as an acceptable target. And it's not Keir Starmer alone there, of course. Jonathan Ashworth also singled out Bangladesh and Bangladeshis in particular. And I think that's because it becomes a synonym for undesirable people from an undesirable country. What I'd say about that is that in Labour, what you have is an absolutely chronic case of selective sensitivity. So when it comes to talking about particular ethnic groups with particular sets of politics, so when we're talking about, for instance, Jewish people who are very pro-Israel, suddenly you're very, very, very sensitive to the possibility of racism, very, very, very sensitive about the language that's used. And if somebody phrases something that falls foul of that very, very, low threshold for sensitivity, then it's, oh my God, anti-Semitism, this person should be drummed out of politics. This has no place in public life, blah, 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 blah. When it comes to other ethnic groups, when it comes to other nationalities, then suddenly you have a very high threshold for sensitivity, right? You have to literally be saying, to put it crudely, and I'm allowed to say this word based on my ethnicity, you have to literally be saying Pakis go home before anyone has a problem with it. But you can do everything short of that. You can use Bangladeshi as a synonym for undesirable person, and that's fine. That's not going to set off your trope detector because it's low sensitivity For some ethnicities, it's very high sensitivity for others.
No, I think that's a very good point about the double standard. Andy McDonald gets the whip suspended for saying he wants people to live in peace and liberty between Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace and liberty between the river and the sea. And then he's suspended because they say, there are some Zionist Jews who get very upset when you say the words river to sea, even if you're saying that you want the Israelis and the Palestinians to all be happy together. Just the words river to sea, that really upsets people. But, Bangladeshis send them home. Maybe some people get upset about that, as evidently they have been, because apparently this video is going around in WhatsApp groups. But, they should just grow up and get over it. You mentioned there Jonathan Ashworth having sort of already made the same rhetorical move as Keir Starmer. He said this on Monday night to Newsnight.
The Rwanda scheme is not a deterrent.
What would your deterrent be?
Well, we're going to send people back. We're going to process people's claims, and we're going to get on with processing people's claims. And those people who shouldn't be here, when they come from countries like Bangladesh or wherever, we're going to send them back.
When they come from Bangladesh or wherever, we're going to send them back. That doesn't sound like someone who is particularly alive and alert to the sensitivities of a community which is quite large and which tends to vote Labour. You mentioned sort of the numbers, Ash. Let's look at how significant a source of irregular migrants Bangladesh is. So these are the nationalities of people coming to Britain in small boats. So you can see the largest amount are from Afghanistan, with 5,700 people arriving in the year to March 2024. And from Iran, it's 3,700. From Turkey, 3,200. Eritrea, 2,800. Syria, then Iraq. Now, obviously, it's going to be hard for politicians to say, well, just send them back to Afghanistan or send them back to Iran. So that's why they're looking for a different country. But Bangladeshis don't even appear in the top 10 when it comes to small boat crossings. It's a slightly different situation, although not that different situation, when you come to asylum seekers that arrive by any route. So according to the BBC, in 2023, the largest number of UK asylum seekers came from Afghanistan with 9,300. The next biggest group, about 7,400 people, came from Iran, followed by Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. So Bangladesh there in 6th place, presumably, or 5th place, according to that. I've also seen on Twitter them being in sort of 6th or 7th. Of course, whenever we discuss this, it is worth noting that however hysterical our political debate can sometimes sound, Britain has relatively few asylum seekers arriving by irregular means. Another BBC graph here shows the number of people who were detected arriving by boat in Italy, the UK, Greece and Spain over a number of years. Italy, shown in green, consistently receives the largest number of people arriving by boat. Last year, over 150,000 people arrived in Italy by this route. In the UK, the figure was less than 50,000, and both Spain and Greece received more. Ash, there's a discussion here about sensitivity and why the Labour Party seem to be picking out Bangladeshis, which to be fair, I do agree with you. It does seem like they just keep saying, well, what about the Bangladeshis? And it's like, well, I think the reason they are is because we do have a fairly recent returns agreement with Bangladesh. And that's why there's sort of, I don't think they are actually trying to dog whistle to get people to hate Bangladeshis.
I don't know. I feel like 50 Cent here. I'm like, what do you say fuck me for?
No, I think it seems at best very insensitive. This general issue, though, sort of Labour are saying they're going to get returns back up and running. It's going to be... what do you think is going to be the response, I suppose, to Labour's management of the border system? Because obviously they're not going to go for open borders. And I think if you sort of say, in principle, we're not going to return anyone anywhere, then essentially you are sort of backing an open borders position. They're obviously not going to do that. So how much sort of leeway do you think they're going to get to operate a borders regime? Or do you think people are sort of going to be quite immediately upset at them for taking the actions that we know they're going to take?
Well, Michael, if you wanted to find out more about our analysis of Labour's immigration position, you should have watched mine and Aaron's Manifesto's breakdown, where we discuss this in a fair bit of detail, but I'll summarise. Basically, Labour's position is this. They say we're going to bring down immigration, it's too high, but they're not going to say to what level, right? What's the right number of immigrants to have, and what kind of immigrants? What are you going to do to bring it down? Now, so far their magic wand has been like reform and competence. So it's like, oh well, we're gonna reform some things, not going to tell you what, and we're going to process claims quicker. All right, now processing claims quicker is, I think, good for everybody, right? Because it means that asylum seekers aren't just hanging around in a torturous state of purgatory for years and years and years. That's a good thing. But if what you're saying is, okay, well, we're going to bring the overall number of migrants down, well, in what way? Are you going to increase the income threshold, which means that ultimately you're pricing out a lot of migrants from filling, the terrible labour shortages that we have in some sectors of this country? Are you going to cut back on international students? Oh, well, we accidentally made universities run like businesses, and international students are the only people keeping those universities financially afloat. Or are you going to crack down on, workplace visas? What are you going to do here? And the answer to that is no one knows. No one knows what they're going to do in this particular area. And it would be, I think, kind of intellectually dishonest for me to say, well, their immigration policy is going to be like this. All they've done is say, immigration's too high. We want to make it lower. They've given no indication for how they're going to do that.
Let's wrap up there. I haven't watched your manifesto's conversation yet, but in my defense, it only came out this afternoon, I think, and I was preparing for tonight's show. So I will make sure I catch up at the first opportunity. Ash, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
You know what? I was wondering why you got me on this evening, and I saw the coconut story and the Bangladeshi story, and I was like, all right. We got the race crimes correspondent on.
Fox, I need a Bangladeshi to talk about this story. Have you thought about Ash Sarkar? You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.